Madam President, I rise today to talk about the tax bill that is before us. I was one of just a few on our side who happened to vote against a procedural motion last night, and I want to talk about why I will be opposing the final passage of this bill. This threat that is facing our country today is greater than any external threat that we have faced for some time. It's an internal threat that is stemming from our own government that threatens the very future of our country. In the words of Admiral Michael Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it's exactly what he said. The biggest threat to our national security is our debt. It's not sustainable, he said. Our country is heading toward fiscal ruin. Nail after nail after nail is being put into our coffin of economic catastrophe. The Senate is now gearing up to put hundreds of billions of more debt onto our already debt-laden country. I really fear that our country's fate could be sealed. So what should we do? Is it too late for the United States to reverse its course? To best answer this question, I am reminded of a famous quote: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." In order to best determine the path that our country will take into the future, we need to examine the road that we've already gone down. This chart is from the Great Recession of 1920 that most people in America have never heard about. It shows that 1920 we had a fairly healthy economy with a little over 5% unemployment. The next year, it had shot up. It had over doubled to almost 12%. Well, during that same period of time, the economy declined by nearly 7%. In other words, GDP went down by almost 7%. From May of 1920 to July of 21, automobile production declined by 60%, and industrial production in America dropped by almost a third. The stock market also fell dramatically. As a matter of fact, it lost half of its value. So you can see the economic time, 1920 to 1921, was dire, maybe even more dire than what we face today. Well, we had a federal government who decided to take a different course. Instead of spending money, what they decided to do was to cut tax rates and cut spending at the same time. President Harding actually proposed, and it was enacted by the House and the Senate, a dramatic cut in federal spending by 1/3. Cut the federal budget by 1/3. Can you imagine that today? Cutting the federal budget by 1/3? Tax rates across the board, marginal tax rates across the board were slashed. Top rate at that time was 75%. They cut it to 25%. So they didn't just cut taxes and raise spending so you balloon the deficit. They cut taxes and cut spending at the same time. What were the results? Well, what do we know about the 1920s? What's a common term that we hear about the 1920s? It's called the Roaring Twenties. It's because the economy boomed during the 1920s. This unemployment rate that was 11.7%, within a year and a half, that fell to a little over 1%. Okay, so it went from 5.2, 11, they cut taxes, cut federal spending, boom, unemployment rate. People had jobs. And guess what happened to the national debt? Not the deficit, the national debt. The national debt was cut by 1/3 during this time. So if you cut taxes, you cut spending, you incentivize the private sector to create jobs. And guess what happened? When more people make more money and more people are employed, more money comes into the federal government to actually not only reduce the deficit, but in this case, actually pay down some of the national debt. Well, let's move forward just a little bit. The Great Depression. The Great Depression, it's been said, many people have said we need to spend money to get us out of an economic downturn. The Great Depression, we had a president, a Republican president, who started this, he was very much an interventionist president. He actually came in. Let me tell you just a few of the things that he did. During the Great Depression, he came in, had trade protectionist policies, raised taxes, and increased federal spending, all kinds of different government projects on infrastructure. We always hear about how infrastructure is going to help take the economy out of the recession if we just spend more and more money. Well, I'll have another point about just spending on infrastructure and government spending in another country in just a minute. But we have to remember, if government, or I ask this simple question, just a simple question to audiences back in Nevada where I talked to. If the Great Depression and spending was going to take us out of that Great Depression, why did the Great Depression last as long as it did? I actually posed that question to the new OMB director. The new OMB director said he's actually studied the Great Depression at length. So I asked him the question, why didn't government spending take us out of the Great Depression? His answer was this. He said, we didn't spend enough money, which was, I was flabbergasted by that statement, but that is his belief, that we did not spend enough money. Many people believe that the stimulus bill that we had here just a year, almost 2 years ago, was not large enough. That's why we haven't had an economic recovery. Well, the Great Depression, the reason we came out of that was not because of government spending. It was because we kind of forgot about the Great Depression because we went to World War II, and our country completely focused on World War II. The stock market did not recover to 1929 levels for 25 years. So the economic policies, FDR was a great wartime president, but his economic policies were not good for this country. Well, where else can we look in history to find whether government spending actually works to take you out of an economic downturn? In Japan during the 1990s, this is actually 88 to 98, they had government spending as a percentage of GDP go up, and yet in Japan, this is the red line, the blue line is spending, the red line is unemployment. It kept going up. Japan tried 6 different stimulus bills, a total of $6 trillion on infrastructure, on all kinds of road projects, bridge projects, everything that you hear about that's supposed to be good to take you out of an economic downturn. Well, the 1990s in Japan is called the lost decade. They had basically zero growth during the 1990s. As a matter of fact, they've had another decade of lost economic output. So Japan certainly is not a good example of a place that you can point to where government spending actually takes you out of an economic downturn. And as a matter of fact, if you think about the $6 trillion that Japan spent, which is much larger than any economic stimulus that we tried, much larger than as a percentage of an economy of what we tried during the Great Depression. So if it was going to work, why didn't it work in Japan? Why didn't it work during the Great Depression? Why didn't it work for the stimulus bill that we tried? By the way, President Obama tried a stimulus bill of close to $800 billion. President Bush, the year before that, 2 years before that, tried an economic stimulus bill of $150 billion, basically sending checks to people, hoping to get them to spend it. You need good economic policy to get you out of an economic downturn, and these temporary little spending bills are not the way to go. So to continue on with this, let me just tell you a little bit about what else happened in Japan. First of all, Japan's public debt grew, 1997, it grew to over 100% of GDP. By 2009, it's now almost 200% of GDP. So this spending not only didn't take them out of an economic downturn, it added to their future problems. And that's, unfortunately, what we're threatening to continue to do today. Well, let me talk about the tax extensions that are before us today. Let me clearly state, I believe that it would be a huge mistake for us to raise taxes on anybody during an economic downturn. I'm for extending the current tax rates and making sure that those tax increases don't go into effect. It's been argued that the other side, especially the top rates, were the reason that we ran up the debt and the deficits during the Bush years. Well, if you remember back when President Bush came into office, similar to what happened when President Obama came into office, he inherited a recession. Then you had 9/11 happen, and it sent us into an even worse recession. Well, in 2001, to stimulate the economy, we did cut taxes. I would say that the mistake we didn't make is we didn't cut spending at the same time, but at least we cut taxes. Well, the blue line are revenues. So when the recession hits, we cut taxes, and it takes a little while to recover. But after that, revenues, and these are the 2001 tax cuts, these are the 2003 tax cuts. The revenues actually went up. The reason for our deficit was not that we didn't have enough money coming into the federal government. The reason for our deficit is we spent too much money. Republicans were thrown out of office because we spent too much money. But the deficit was not caused by the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003. So it would be a mistake to raise taxes during this economic downturn. However, I do believe that we need to cut spending based on the economic models that I've already talked about during the 1920s, how it actually worked when you cut taxes and cut spending at the same time, how it can actually pull your country out of an economic downturn. Well, there are businesses across my state. I spent a lot of the last couple of months touring around my state, talking to businesses. One small business owner, these two women, they started a small company called Nothing Bundt Cakes. They make little bundt cakes. And unfortunately, they are really, really good because I like to eat them, and it's not good for my waistline. But they have a great product, and I was talking to them, and they would love to expand their business right now. You know what they said to me? They said, we can't. Two reasons. One is we think our taxes are going to be going up, and so we can't plan for it. And two was the effects of the health care bill. We don't know how much that's going to cost us. So it's the uncertainty out there of why they would not expand their business, and they probably could have created another 20, 30, 40 jobs. Those jobs didn't get created because of the uncertainty of what's going on. So extending the tax cuts, I believe, extending the current tax rates is a better way to say it. I believe that's very important to give businesses some certainty. It's not the only thing we need to do to give them certainty, but it's certainly one of those things that is important. In this bill, which I agree with, I think it's good that we're not going to let the death tax go back up to 55%. So there's a lot of small businesses out there. Try to imagine trying to plan estate planning and things like that, especially in a small business where you want to see it continue. And all of a sudden, well, maybe it's going to go down. Well, now we're going to do a 2-year extension. Very difficult to plan for those things for the future. We need to give more certainty. 2 years is better than nothing that's in this bill, but still, we need to make that longer term so that you can do estate planning and business continuation planning. Because think about if a small business is owned by a family versus a business that's owned by a corporation. If somebody dies in the corporation, the business just continues. If somebody dies in a small business where the principal owns the business, they may have to sell the business to pay the taxes. That business actually may end up getting closed down, and those jobs are lost. So it's important to give some certainty when it comes to death tax planning, estate tax, whatever term you want to use with it. That's important, especially for small businesses, ranches, farms across America. The top rate that we keep hearing criticized as far as extending that, they say it's only 1%, 2%, 3% of the people, whatever number that I've heard tossed out from the other side. What people fail to realize, though, is that's 25 to 35 million people are employed by those very small businesses that make the top rate. So if you raise taxes on those people, they have less money to spend to buy that next piece of equipment. Somebody had to make that, and if it's in America, that created jobs in America. Or they can't hire that next employee. So we don't get the job creation that we want. So raising taxes on small businesses would be a mistake. Raising taxes on the middle class would be a mistake. Because if they have more taxes, especially if they can plan that long term, if the rates they know are going to be there for a long term, they can put that in part of their budget. If it's just a one-time check, I actually disagree with the payroll tax that's in here, the way it's structured, the same way that in President Bush's stimulus package a couple of years ago, where we sent $600 back to individuals. Think about the mentality of families. If there's a difficult time that families are going through, if they get a check in the mail and they know they may be losing a job or they're barely getting by as it is, they get a little money in the bank. Are they going to spend that? Or are they maybe going to either pay down debt or save that because of the uncertain economic future? A lot of families are making the decision to save that or pay down debt. So it's not really stimulating the economy like people think that it will. And the problem also with the payroll tax and some of the other taxes that are in this bill that are extended, it's just adding to our national debt. Now, a couple of points on to go back just one quick thing. The Bush economic growth package, his stimulus bill that he put together, we've heard about this being a bipartisan agreement. Well, that bill was passed 81-16. Every single Democrat actually voted for that bill. 16 Republicans voted against it, but it was a bipartisan bill. People grabbed hands and added more money to our debt. They talk about this bill being a compromise. Democrats wanted certain things, Republicans wanted certain things. Here's what a compromise is around this body. A compromise is, you want certain things, I want certain things, we'll both get what we want, and we'll pass that debt on to our children and our grandchildren. That's how this body's operating right now. We are being fiscally irresponsible with the bill that is before us today. Yes, we need to extend the tax rates, but we should have at least sent a message to the rest of the world that said, we are going to do something about the debt that is coming. Can you put the chart up? That statement's fine first. We just had the Debt Commission a few weeks ago come out with their report, the President's Debt Commission. This is one of the quotes from it. America cannot be great if we go broke. And that's exactly what we're doing, is we're going broke. Harken back to the first chart, Admiral Mullins. Remember what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said. I want to repeat this. This is so important. He said, the biggest threat to our national security is our debt. He said it's not sustainable. This debt is real. It's a huge threat to the very future and prosperity of America. This bill before us is sending a message to the markets, to the bond markets. It's saying that, even though the Debt Commission came out and said, we need to trim this by at least $4 trillion, this spending and this deficit that we have going, you know what? We're just going to add hundreds of billions of more to that problem. So I believe that what we have before us is even going to get worse. Before this bill that we vote on today, these are the projections, the president's projections. The red bars here are interest that we pay every year on international debt. Interest. It's like interest on your credit card. Family pays interest on a credit card, doesn't get anything for it. It's just because of their overspending habits. Well, this is a result of Congress's overspending habits. In 2011, next year, it's going to be close to $250 billion. We get nothing for that. No roads, no schools, no veterans benefits, no anything. That's just money we're paying to the Saudis, the Chinese, other foreign governments who have bought our debt. 2012 goes up further. 2020, it's over $900 billion a year in interest on the national debt. That's more than we pay for Social Security, Medicare, or national defense. And you get nothing for that. This path that we are on is unsustainable. Greece earlier this year, we saw what happened to Greece. Within 48 hours, it was an economic, literally, implosion, and if they wouldn't have had the European Union to bail them out, their country literally would have gone bankrupt. Ireland, not too long ago, within about 7 days, same thing happened in Ireland. Once again, they had the European Union to bail them out. What happens if America? Same thing happens here. Just this morning, Mr. President, just this morning, this is what Moody's, one of the rating agencies, said. Unless there are offsetting measures, that means spending cuts, the package is the bill we have before us today, will be credit negative for the U.S. and increase the likelihood of a negative outlook on the U.S. government's AAA rating during the next 2 years. In common language, what does this say? This says we're becoming a bigger risk, and it's threatening our AAA rating, which means if this AAA rating goes down, we pay higher interest rates. If you're more of a risk, just like an individual, you're more of a risk. When you borrow money, you pay a higher interest rate. This number here, if that AAA rating, this is based on a AAA rating. These numbers all get much worse if we lose our AAA rating. So, Mr. President, the bill that we have before us, we should have sent a message while we were continuing the current tax rates. We should have, if we wanted to do the unemployment benefits, which I believe we should have extended, we should have done that with spending cuts in other places. Senator Coburn has a package to vote on of real spending cuts. I've offered amendment after amendment after amendment on this floor on spending cuts. We always hear during campaigns, I'm for fiscal responsibility, I'm for this, I'm for that. When it comes to voting, we never seem to get the votes. When are we going to actually show some fiscal responsibility around this place? This bill should have at least $100 billion, $200 billion in offsets. This bill says, by the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, says that it's going to add $900 billion to the debt. $900 billion. Well, shouldn't we at least have offset some of that to show the world that we were actually serious about fiscal responsibility? That's all I'm saying that we should have done and why I'm voting against this bill. Because I don't think we can continue to just add more and more and more debt. The Debt Commission had it right. America cannot be great if America is broke. So let me conclude. The 1920s showed when you're in an economic downturn, if you cut government spending and cut tax rates at the same time, you can have economic recovery without adding to the debt, actually, because the economy grows and you've held the line on spending, you can actually pay down the debt. That's what we did at the late 1990s. We didn't actually cut spending then, but we at least slowed the rate of growth of spending as Republicans in Congress with the Democrat president. And we had economic growth, which got us to not only a balanced budget, but actually got us to where we were paying down some of the debt. That's really what we need to do now, is start going back to 2008 spending levels. Spending increased well over double digits the last couple of years around this place. Let's go, and we were spending plenty of money in 2008. So let's go back to 2008 levels. That'll save us a couple $100 billion. And then let's work on eliminating, as Senator Coburn has identified, a lot of the wasteful programs in the country, which is at least another $150 billion in wasteful programs that he's discovered. If we send a message to the rest of the world that this country is actually serious about debt, then we will continue to be the leader of the world, and our economy can continue to grow, and America's best days really can be ahead of us. But if we choose to continue to be fiscally irresponsible, then I'm afraid we could be headed down a path that we cannot reverse. And if what happened to Greece and what happened to Ireland happens to the United States, as I mentioned before, there is no one to bail us out. So we need to start acting in a fiscally responsible way, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Americans. And to say to these young people like we have sitting here before us today, you know, we care about you and we care about your future. And we want America to be as great for you as it has been for us. And the only way to do that is to make sure we get our fiscal house in order and quit passing so much debt onto future generations. Mr. President, I yield the floor.